Hello everyone, I'm Ellie, and today we're addressing the question, can fashion be political? And I do want to ask this question because we are drowning in fast fashion essentially, and there is a real threat that these garments and their wastefulness is a symptom of those in power, which is often privileged, greedy executives who are basically men who desire to reach unlimited profit goals while the planet carries the weight of it. And as working class work towards that, they're forced to live in that system. So when we talk about fast fashion and just fashion in general, I do think we must mention climate justice, labor rights, colonial histories, and capitalism. And we also have to examine luxury fashion within the entire industry, because there has been a recent case where Willy Chavarría, a Chicano LA-based designer, recently debuted in Paris Fashion Week and got into a recent collaboration with Adidas to sell Oaxacan-inspired huaraches that face a lot of backlash. So when I talk about the industry, I am not only talking about fast fashion, I'm also talking about luxury fashion. But to get into Willy's case, he specifically faced backlash from Oaxacan officials for cultural appropriation. So we must examine how this came to be, and we also have to address that fashion should and can be inherently political if you're still not in agreement that it already is. And also we have to understand that fashion is deeply rooted in power, legislation, and social change. So if you're new here, welcome to Susty Talks. It is a community-centered podcast that aims to spark genuine conversations around ethical fashion, sustainable change, and intersectional solutions. And it's all about being a space that can drive positive change and empower action, making sustainability more accessible and relevant to everyone. And this is a self-funded initiative. So if you want to support my work, you can go to my Depop and my eBay, where I try to rehome vintage items, and I'm currently working on some Mexican artisanal collections that will take a couple months to put together, but its aim is to inspire upcycling and to tell different stories that challenge mainstream narratives in the industry. So to get into the podcast on how fashion can be political, I do want to note that for me, I think fashion is like a mirror. I do think that we're in incredibly dark times, and fashion, I think, is one of the biggest and clearest mirrors of global inequity and inequality that reflects immigrants making record low wages and casts a huge shadow over the marginalized workers, which are basically vulnerable women who build the wealth for just a tiny fraction of our society, which is the men at top most of the cases. And that's politics. That's the 1%, those that hold the most money. And to state this obvious truth is difficult because our society has a harder time swallowing the truth than I think we would like to admit. I feel like it's really easy to push away all the things that are happening and ignore it because we feel like we can't really do anything, that we can't fix anything. And yet we live in these problems. We have to grapple with situations. The tariffs are coming and affecting us whether we want to or not. Like in Walmart, the prices are being raised. Brands are raising how much things are. There is so much changes happening because of politics, and fashion doesn't escape that struggle. And it's sad to say, but I feel like our identity is tied up into our fashion choices, our fashion consumerism. We are tied up in what we wear and how we wear it and where we buy it, and it just becomes who we are, or at least a part of our identity. So in many ways, the industry is part of our everyday lives, and we are part of also creating it. And as we continue to move forward in our current economic system known as capitalism, which is ruled by the dollar, fashion is very much political under this capitalistic regime. But again, there's a lot of different ways we can approach this. We can be apathetic, we can continue to be apathetic, or we can move towards care. And it's not a black or white situation. Sometimes we can be apathetic to certain things, sometimes we can care about other issues. But I do think the good news in life is that we can always make choices. We can always try to decide to do better and to make other decisions that can reflect ethos or values of care, where we can prioritize, the planet, we can prioritize labor rights, we can prioritize the preservation of the earth versus exploitation, versus continuing to support fast fashion and to further support liberation for all. And I do want to remind us that the government should be working for us. Policies should be for us. We normal people elect the officials that are supposed to be working for our benefit, but there's been a history of that not happening. So yes, we are normal people, but we have a system that should be working for us. And those in power should, in theory, have ranked up with our support, with our intent, with our collective decision making. And so when we think about intent and impact in our actions, I feel like they have been almost reduced because of a sense of a narrative that politics is removed from us, or systems are removed from us when they're supposed to be for us. So no matter what destructive systems are in place right now, no matter how chaotic the world is, no matter how far we fall into apathy, I do think that there is always a chance to build a better and more just future. And so when we look at fast fashion, and it is a mirror essentially to the politics in place, the policies in place that only prioritize the race to the bottom, I do always believe that we can change those in power to move a different path, to step away from exploitation, to step away from these toxic narratives of who should be in power and for what reasons. But this kind of alludes to something called fashion social production. So to untangle what this means, basically we can't forget that fashion is socially produced. So this kind of means that society makes our clothing. So again, women, garment workers make our things. They're physically in the factories, on their sewing machines, sewing piece after piece after piece after piece after piece. As you listen to this podcast, they're probably sewing away. The hum of the sewing machines are buzzing in their ears, leading to, hearing problems. The microfibers are being breathed in the minute that they sew something, and they're inhaling that every single minute. And that can lead to health issues like lung issues, because all those fibers accumulate and can cause them to get some sort of lung cancer or whatever else that is produced from breathing in all those fibers. So this is very much a reality that everyone is living in, especially in the global south, where they're struggling to find dignified work that allows them to have a good, dignified life. I think it's very easy to forget that they're the ones producing it when we're wandering around in the malls, in the stores, and buying online, but they are the ones burdened with the human cost of greed and with the unbridled production cycles that are pushing out clothing in an unprecedented rate. And for what, when we have enough clothing to clothe the next 6 generations? So these women, these real humans, are basically sewing themselves to death to stay afloat for our fast fashion collections. And also they're often employed in luxury fashion brands. And I don't want to say that these garment workers have a better life because of their work, because often enough they go from their rural village to cities to be employed to escape other cycles of poverty. But when you're only paid very little, cents even, it's very impossible to escape cycles of poverty. And there is this thing where they call the global south third world countries when they're not. I do think there's this toxic narrative from the United States and European countries that see others to be used, to see trade deals as a way to make more money at the cost of human rights. And I don't think that's right. I do think there's a lot of greed when it comes to making money within the global south. And I am very much convinced that brands know what they're doing, and they fake the sense of oh, we don't know what we're doing, hence we're not going to take accountability, to continue unbridled production cycles for for what? For what, Like, it's just a bunch of things that we don't need. They have said that there is like enough clothing to clothe the next 6 generations, and we have so much landfills, and there's so much being sent to countries like Chile, where the Atacama Desert is literally being dumped with fast fashion items. They themselves don't want that, they have to burn it, and they've been trying to pass laws and policies to limit how much is coming in. So women and countries and a lot of people that don't have as much power as colonial European countries are literally being burdened with our industry. And I don't think this is fair. I don't think we need to continue oppressive and colonial ideals, especially within the globalization of the industry. I don't want to say I'm totally against globalization. I think there's good things in working with other countries and other brands and other workers around the world. It's just within our current economic system, globalization has meant toxic supply chain contracts that use other countries with no mercy. So these workers end up being stuck in sweatshops for 12 plus hours every day. They barely make money to survive and often struggle to send their children to school. And again, they can't break cycles of poverty. So when we talk about solutions, they must include garment worker rights, and they must include their voices, and we must reckon with the reality. We all do. It's not just brands that have to reckon with this. It's us as well, the consumers who wear the clothing that they've produced. We wear their blood, basically, their sweat and their tears, because they often are in a lot of pain to create what they create. But I do want to get into the Willy Chavarría case to contextualize a bit more of these big ideas that I've been talking about. So when we see Chicano designer Willy Chavarría and his recent debut with the Adidas collaboration for the Huaraches, which is it's a hybrid basically of the original Huarache with the slip-on shoes that we've recently been popularizing, but it has some woven design in there that's reminiscent of the leather design of the Mexican Huaraches. I think he most likely thought this was a good design effort because he thought he was like praising or celebrating his heritage within the shoe somehow by copying the design. But instead he faced a lot of backlash. Critics accused him and also Adidas for using the culture, his culture, and basically misrepresenting the Huarache, and also profiting off indigenous craftsmanship without giving back to that community who essentially is skilled within that art form. So social media users also have gone on to mock the design. They called it a genderfied Huarache, but the controversy isn't just about how the shoe looked or like the aesthetics of the shoe. It also attacked the idea that he called the shoe the Oaxaca slip-on because it borrows heavily on centuries-old traditions of artisan skills, but yet it was produced in China. So like the production of it was criticized when it's traditionally a Oaxacan shoe. Again, it far removed the indigenous communities in Mexico from the process, and Oaxacan officials went on to say that the brand never got permission from the Yelanglang, I think I'm saying that right, artisans within the community that make them and who directly inspired the sneaker. The thing is here, if you want my personal opinion, is that I'm not really surprised this happened. I was very suspicious of Willy when he debuted in Paris Fashion Week because he did come from a fast fashion background. He worked for many different major brands, very creative, very skilled, very visionary, but like what I've seen with creatives and designers who work in fast fashion brands is that they often replicate the systems that they're working in. And so I imagine he had a habit to take without permission and have audacity to do so with no repercussion. And even if he had a sense that he was gonna face a lawsuit, the protection of having Adidas behind him means a lot of money is behind him, a lot of legal authority is behind him, brands, especially fashion brands, have so much legal protection behind them. They have lawyers, they know how to like tackle class lawsuits. For example, Shein and Temu are being fined left and right for their production processes. So like they're so used to understanding how to like fight back that I don't even think Chavarría was worried about this in any sense. And if he had been, he would have been covered. He would have had his sugar daddy behind him. So the thing is, like, when you have a lot of power and when you have a lot of people giving you permission to take, sometimes it's not within your mind to ask for permission, to ask communities to get involved. And I'm sad to say that he has this sense to just take, that he didn't move out of this mindset to work with Oaxacans and to show them respect and to invite them into the process, especially when he has shown so much advocacy for Latinos, and especially because his runway shows directly show the struggles that Latinos face. I'm assuming that he thought the Adidas collaboration was like an easy partnership. He thought maybe it resonated, especially because of his advocacy in the past. And he's worked with Adidas in the past. He's released sneakers. So maybe he just felt like it was just something to make money from. But these good intentions should never overshadow the deeper issues that carry it out. So I do want to distinguish cultural appropriation with cultural appreciation. So in the case of Chavarría, I would say that this is especially an interesting case because he is a Chicano designer who is selling Mexican athletic products with Adidas, despite now being a luxury fashion designer, because he debuted in Paris Fashion Week a couple months ago for his spring/summer 2026 collection. So there's a lot going on that we first have to unpack to understand like whether he appropriated or appreciated and like where he's coming from. And you would think he would inherently know how to appreciate his own culture as a Latino man, but this is an example we cannot assume is true. You can be Latino and still uphold toxic race theories and prioritize profit over people. And so as a fast fashion designer in his past, I don't think he knows how to appreciate his own culture through business practices, which often enough means giving credit, working with his own people, and making sure they benefit communities and those that consume the product. Again, fast fashion brands like Adidas doesn't ever treat their workers fairly, nor do they want to protect the environment, nor do they think about the consequences when they mass produce designs overseas. And so to top all this off, we're talking about huaraches here, okay? And they often mean more to the community than at face value. So they're actually seen as special. They're seen as a form of traditional art with very deep meaning. So when you make a carbon copy of that in China within sweatshop labor, it's deeply disrespectful. So Felicia Montes, who is a Chicana indigenous artist, explained that this designer's mistake was basically not working with the community. That's what it comes down to, who actually make these real huaraches. She believes that just because someone shares Mexican passion or roots doesn't mean that they should use their culture without supporting it. He should have had the courage, the care, and basic respect for his culture to collaborate with Oaxacan artisanal communities in Mexico, pay them fairly to produce them, and uplift the people who made them. And I was so relieved when Chavarría actually went on to apologize and said, "I am deeply sorry that the shoes was appropriated in the design and not developed in direct and meaningful partnership with the Oaxacan community." And I do think that his statement, his apology, makes him very much aware of where he went wrong, what he has done, and maybe he'll recover from his mistakes. But he does have a history of producing fast fashion collaborations with Adidas. And also, honestly, I want to say, I do think he would have been forgiven even if he hadn't apologized, because he has shown so much appreciation, so much advocacy for Latinos within his role as a luxury fashion designer, and has really been breaking a lot of grounds in the industry. But again, I do think he has a lot to improve on. I do think he has to rethink his product strategy and know what to produce and for what reasons. And I think this just kind of alludes that people no longer just want carbon copies. They no longer want cheap copies of very authentic artisanal products. So I don't think it's even enough anymore for any designer to just steal from others anymore and to expect a large amount of money without being questioned in the process. Yeah, I just feel like a lot more people have to remind themselves that they don't need to be a fast fashion creator. They don't need to continue on with the capitalistic ways of production and consumerism that have been entrenched in our lives for so long. So with Willy's case, I think he also just needs a reminder that he can do things in a better way, that he doesn't have to continue being a fast fashion designer, and to basically find his strengths in his creative vision that is rooted in his community and working with them directly. But I do think that Mexico has become more wary of designers to the point where the president of Mexico made official statements being like, this is wrong and y'all need to fix it. And there was even more statements from her saying big companies often take products, ideas, and designs from indigenous communities, and we are looking at the legal part to be able to support them. So Adidas has also made moves to support Oaxacans after this controversy. So they're basically now in contact with Oaxacan officials to discuss the restitution to the people who were plagiarized, and within an emailed statement, they even said to BBC that it recognizes and values the cultural richness of Mexico's indigenous communities and the meaning of their artisanal heritage. So that is all positive news, and honestly I'm kind of surprised it came so fast. It was a couple of days afterwards that all of this unrolled, and I feel like I'm so late in talking about this in this podcast, but the way that they moved so quickly and where online users were so aware of what was going on really does show that people are interested and involved in the fashion industry more so than probably ever before because of social media. But again, the question is, can fashion be political? Well, another thing that I want to talk about is that because he's a Los Angeles-based designer, there is so much he can tap into in his city. He's been in Fresno, California, but Los Angeles is super close by, and he can always travel or live there wherever he may be. He can always tap into Los Angeles, which is a vibrant city with a garment district. So many of the people who work there are actually immigrant men and women and are very skilled. They come from a background of maybe their own artisanal craftsmanship, or maybe just knew how to sew and mend out of survival, or it was just passed down from mom to mom or grandma to grandma. But for years they were paid under a system called the piece rate system, where workers were paid just a few cents for each piece of clothing they made, such as a shirt, such as a pair of jeans. And this meant that they were forced to sew pieces of garments over and over and over and over and over again every single day to survive. And they actually didn't even end up making minimum wage, no matter how many hours they worked. And sometimes they were working like 10 to 12, 13 hours, like overtime, with no overtime pay. It was just always a piece rate system. And basically this system forces them to work really hard and allows the factory owners to justify pushing these workers to go faster and faster and faster. And so because the work is so intense that many have developed painful injuries because of this, like carpal tunnel syndrome from repeating the same motion again and again and again. But the good thing is policies and laws can change systems. So recently, garment workers in LA won a huge victory that they fought for and won, which is basically the legal right to be paid at least minimum wage for their work in factories that are producing clothing. So it was a very hard battle. It took years and years and years and years of strategy, leaders, organizing, and advocacy to have their lives be positively changed to the better so they can actually make minimum wage. And this passed like a year ago. So there is so much change still. to be one. I think they're currently working on exploring the Chinese speaking factories. Some factories still have a piece rate system, so I imagine some like Chinese factories are still scheming on how to pay very little to workers that don't know their rights. So there's always a lot of change that we can continue to work on. So yeah, I do think that politics can work in our favor. Maybe I'm just being an optimistic person here, delusionally optimistic, but often enough I'm always asking myself, like, who made our clothing and at what cost? You know, I think that's somewhere we can always start off with. And I do think that there's this like assumption that once we start thinking about these questions, it becomes like more so what we wear. But again, fashion isn't just political because of how we look like or what we dress or like just the physical clothing itself. I do think there's so much more at play. It's more about the people involved in making the clothing. It's about the systems they work under and the choices that we make every day, and then clothing is the reflection of that. And when we understand clothing in that way, it becomes more than the fabric, obviously. It becomes more than random thread, and it starts to become more so a messenger of symbols, of meaning, and it can also be like a signal, you know, that we can send out into the world that can connect what we see and what we say and believe. And yet I think many of us are fooled to think that it's like frivolous, that fast fashion brands are the ones that dictate beauty, dictate meaning, but that's just all run by privileged people who just want to make a lot of money and who do not care about us, who make fashion seem just like a random fun and cheap thing, who make it seem frivolous, and who constantly push out these trendy collections to make us feel like we are part of society somehow by conforming and looking like everyone else. And to this point, I just want to say, like, have we ever like actually really stopped to think about how much time we spend shopping? Because I spend so much time shopping. I also walk so many miles. I'm like going up the mall and down the hallways, like just looking at storefronts, looking at options, and like my eyes are like taking everything in. And honestly, it's a lot of work. You're also watching other people, watching each other, comparing, admiring, you know, like just even judging to like not be bored or to like experience fashion or like consumerism. We don't really consciously think about how we function in the mall and how we consume. But honestly, I feel like we're often bored when we go to the mall. Maybe that's just me, but I'm often bored when I go to the mall. And I've felt that within my own family unit, within my own friends, where like we kind of go to the mall to like escape dullness, basically, or like escape some boredom outside of like the 9 to 5. It can also be like a replacement for a third space, which is like a space outside of work and home. But yeah, so in that way, like, because we spend so much time in the mall, because we've normalized it so much, I do think it's not hard to understand why fast fashion is so embedded in American life. Like, I personally grew up with the malls. Fast fashion has always been part of my childhood. I grew up looking at the displays and thinking, oh my God, I want to look like that. I've always saw the same brands in magazines and always saw how everyone else followed certain trends, and those were the people that made it up to be like the popular cool kid club. So yeah, I do think fast fashion is part of my life, whether I want to admit it or not, and it's essentially part of yours as well if you like fashion. It's just been normalized for so long that I don't think we hardly notice it unless we're very much against fast fashion and understand basically what we're looking at. But to understand what we're looking at, I do think we need to unlearn a lot of things, and we have to like really consider what was taught to us and what was accepted in our brain without really realizing, and try to obtain a new lens or new perspective basically and the truth behind our clothing. I don't know, for me at least, like I'm a neurodivergent, so like I often question everything. I'm very curious by nature. I don't really accept what people are telling me without really thinking about it like 2 or 3 or 4 times. And I'm very prone in seeing the systems at play and how they work really well or maybe not that well. So for me, I think I have an ability to see the things that are going on in a bit of a different lens. But you can always watch YouTube documentaries about what's going on in the industry. You can always watch my live streams if you want, where I tackle the issues and the news in the industry. And you can always read books. I'm someone that's very introverted, very much a private person. So I like to actually process and think about things that I read. It's just a daily process of figuring out what's going on in the industry and navigating towards a better future if we end up caring to do so. But again, it's not our fault what's happening in the industry. And I also want to say the everyday person is struggling to survive. It's really hard to afford to have personal time, to not constantly be working. But if the collective together supports something else outside of fast fashion, then I do think that change will come. But if we end up not doing anything, then obviously it's going to be very hard for things to change. So it does take all of us to constantly be doing something together so that we can prevent more garment workers to be exploited, to prevent the merciless destruction of our earth, and for something to eventually give. We'll have to continue to work towards something, towards alternatives. And this leads me to politicians and systemic change once more, because with politicians, they in theory can and should do something. There's really recently been caucuses around sustainable fashion. There's been the retail caucus. There's been a slow fashion caucus. They are promising basically bold, necessary action to move forward in the midst of fast fashion. They could pass laws, they could hold brands accountable. They could show leadership that prioritizes people and the planet. But often enough, that is not happening. So the responsibility often falls back into our own hands. Again, not because we're here to fix the issues, but because politicians are operating in a system that they're comfortable in and living within and uplifting. So it forces us basically to imagine a new future. It forces us to believe in something else beyond what we currently have. And in this case, to believe that a new fashion industry is possible in midst of our current political power players. But I do think this takes a lot of empathy as well, not just political strategy, because to actually take grounded, empathetic, caring action, we are acting out of a care or understanding of garment workers. We understand what they go through. We're picturing their pain in their bodies. We understand the tears, the pain, the cycles of hurt that they've endured to survive. And sometimes I hope that if we could all really meet garment workers and understand them and live in their shoes for one day, we could really just fall in love with advocacy and fall in love with a better way for the industry in general. But a lot of times I haven't met a lot of people that have understood what garment workers go through. They have never met them personally. They've never really felt their pain. So to wake people really up, I think it would take human connection and human stories and a belief that we can understand each other even when we have different cultures. But then there's this thing in the back of my head. I'm like, what if we can't help but buy fast fashion? Not because we're lazy, not because we're not empathetic, not because we don't care, but because of the illusion of choice that we have been given. So if I walk in the mall or scroll through any shopping site, for example, it feels like there's 1,000 and thousands and thousands of options. There's so many options, but in reality, most of it is just copy and paste clothing. It's just slightly different versions of the same style, but it's just sold everywhere. Maybe there's a different shade here and there. Maybe there's a different button, but it's all the same, very badly made clothes. So the thing is, can we really blame ourselves when everything is so cheap and there's not a lot of information there? And I do think that the brands need to tell us exactly what's going on. They need to tell us how this was produced, what the fabric cause. So I do think they need to be very transparent and more accountable to the damages that they're producing. But we can always continue to ask questions. Like, we can ask, like, why do trends exist in the first place? You know, we can all answer that question. We can theorize on, like, what's the purpose of fast fashion and what do they serve in the long run. I kind of alluded to the answer to that question in the beginning of this podcast, but also I do think it benefits all of us to ask, do brands actually create our sense of style, or is it just something that they're selling us? Just reflecting, thinking about things is important, and it can really help us move away from distractions of like, oh, we need this and we need that in the mall, and instead we can become a bit more introspective instead. But the thing is, we've become so heavily invested in aesthetics that often enough it takes a lot of space and time in our head. I feel like now it's just become normalized to fit in, to look a certain way. It focuses on our looks versus like how much of a political transparency aspect it has versus how transparent it is or how ethically produced it was. I do think that the aesthetics of the world has become so much more important as social media has really made waves in our lives. So I do think we should measure more of our worth in how we're politically involved or civically involved. If we like spend less time in the mall, maybe it could help us like spend more time trying to understand like who represents us and like make them be held more accountable to their actions. And honestly, like, we need to be watching them very closely because they be trying to get away with the most random thing. Again, it's like fashion isn't just how we look. Like, we can't just simply dress in a way that feels political. We can't just like post on social media about how fashion is political. Like, I'm not saying to stop doing that, it matters, but like, don't stop there. Like, if we really want change, we have to go beyond aesthetic statements. Like, we need systems to change and for the industry to be less harmful. Still, it's like really easy to forget this when we're like scrolling on our phones that show influencers with their rich lifestyles and like haul videos that make fashion look fun and harmless and completely normal. But the normalization is very dangerous and it keeps cycles of materialism going. And so this leads me to making better fashion choices. So in the middle of all this noise, how do we actually choose better? So for starters, we can always support brands and politicians who are not tied to corporate interests. Those who are not engaged in a race to the bottom, which is again a phrase used to describe brands that cut costs at any expense to people, the planet, and product quality. But consumers will always have a choice, but that in itself won't dismantle a global system built on exploitation, nor will we be able to undo centuries and centuries and centuries of colonialism that has been propped up by capitalism. But consumer choices alone won't dismantle a global system built on exploitation, nor will they undo centuries of colonialism propped by capitalism. But knowing how fashion is connected to politics and power is a start that can really help us. You know, it can help us understand our global neo-colonial supply chain. It can help us understand how brands often source garments from the global south. We can understand how they extract labor at a very cheap rate while keeping profit and decision-making in the global south. And when we see fashion through that lens, the illusion of choice often can start to break apart, and we can start to see it for what it really is. And from then on, we really can't and shouldn't unsee it. But we do need a scheme. We need a scheme for a better fashion industry. We need to create more paths towards bills and policies that can transform our supply chain. We need to make more choices that align with worker rights and planet preservation. We can vote for politicians who care about people over profit and that prioritize sustainability and ethics, but we need good people in the hands of power. So we have to build people up. We have to let others with good hearts and good intentions and grounded ethics be leaders in our society. And history has shown that collective power can make a difference. So please don't think we can't do anything. I'm not saying it will be easy. I think it's just up to us to envision how we move forward with care. So again, this is your reminder that we don't need to be perfect people, but rather more informed citizens that take action and are politically involved. It doesn't matter how we dress or what we look like or, where we're from. I do think what matters is that we step up and move away from systemic greed and corruption. And after all, I do believe that fashion is political. Until next time, peace and love, Ellie. Bye.